Friends, let me welcome you to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name's Peter Lowen, and I happen to be the director here at the school. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this online conversation on spy balloons and national security. We've got three remarkable people joining us today. Melanie Sisson is a fellow at the Brookings Institution and a globally leading expert on the applications of technology and AI to intelligence. Vincent Rigby is a longtime Canadian civil servant, very recently the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada and a visiting professor at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill. And our host for this conversation needs no introduction, but he's was a longtime host of Canada's national broadcast, Peter Mansbridge. And for my money, just a wonderful person to convene a conversation on anything, but especially this pressing and curious topic. So Peter, thanks very much for being with us here at the Munk School, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, from one Peter to another, thank you very much. Melanie and Vincent, it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you about a subject that has fascinated people, I guess around the world over these last couple of weeks. At times we felt like we were in a major Hollywood movie, and other times we felt like we were in a B or C Hollywood movie because of the way the facts have changed on this thing. So let me start with that point and ask each of you, because the information has changed a lot, facts have changed a lot on this story in the last 10 days. At this point, what's the single most important question that you have about what's been happening over these past couple of weeks? Melanie, why don't you start?
Well, thanks, Peter, very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. So thanks to Munk and to you for having me. I really appreciate it in these very interesting times. I think my primary unanswered question is fairly parochial, which is this, what parts of the U.S. government knew what and when, and how was the information transmitted across the interagency? The timing of the reports has been out of sequence in terms of indicating where the United States government first became aware of the balloon's existence, and then its course of travel, and then, of course, all the communications about what was to be done with it from there. And so my unanswered question is who knew what, when, and how was that transmitted again across the U.S. interagency?
Why do you think we're still asking that question, 10 days, 2 weeks in?
I don't have a good answer to that. I think part of the reason we're still asking it is that there's a public affairs concern. I think part of why we might still be asking is that the government might still be asking. That's not entirely clear to me that they've sort of done all the process tracing. And then if they have done that, if they've thought through how they want to convey that to external audiences, US audiences, Canadian audiences, and certainly the PRC as an audience as well.
Vincent, what about you? What's your biggest unanswered question here?
Well, Peter, first of all, thanks to you and to the Munk School for having me on today. This is a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you. And I have to say, as Peter said at the outset, 30 years in government, I don't think I've ever come across an episode quite like this. And I've looked at national and international security issues in great detail over that span of time. This is an interesting one, I have to say. The big one for me, I think, would probably be Chinese motivation. So if you break this out into the original spy balloon, as they're calling it, and we accept that it is a spy balloon, versus the other three, which were effectively, we seem to think, quasi high school science projects that should or should not have been shot down. At the end of the day, that's a separate debate. But with that first balloon, was it an accident that it passed into US and Canadian airspace, or was it designed? Was it conscious on the part of the Chinese? And there was a great story in the Washington Post earlier this week, based on some sources within the US government, suggesting that it was actually an accident and that the US had been tracing the balloon since it was launched from China, but the balloon was actually supposed to do surveillance over Hawaii and Guam, and then for some reason got blown off course, went northeast across the Pacific into Alaska, into Canada, then down into the States. I kind of like the accident theory because I cannot believe for the life of me that the Chinese would send this into US airspace right before the Blinken visit to China. It just did not make sense to me. So I'm not going to say I'm hoping it was an accident, but that might be a better story for China, US, Western relations at the end of the day. It's difficult to say. It's still interesting that the balloon, when it went into U.S. airspace, just accidentally flew over U.S. missile sites in Montana. And so is it a case and oh, we're here. Why don't we fly over these missile sites and see what we can see? So those are all questions that are really still gnawing at me. What happened here?
You know, the problem I have even with the term spy balloon is this thing was huge, right? I mean, they say 4 school buses long. You think of a spy situation that nobody knows you're doing it. They can't see you. Well, this was visible from the ground. So it's not like there was any trouble knowing it was there, identifying it as from China, I guess was the first stage of figuring it out. But in terms of a spy situation, I mean, if China wants to spy on American missile sites, surely they can use one of their satellites, just like the Americans use their satellites to spy on whether it's China or Russia or anywhere else. So I've had this problem from the beginning of even that term. I tend to believe, like you do, that it was an accident, partly for those reasons. I mean, you can see it, you know where it's going, and you can eventually figure out whose it is.
Well, this is where it also gets.
Yeah,
sorry
go
to
ahead.
interrupt. This is where it also gets confusing, because I agree. You can see it on the ground, and people are coming out of their houses and looking up at the sky. But on the other hand, you've got the commander of NORAD and the commander of Northern Command saying we had gaps in our surveillance, and that some of these whether you want to call them balloons or dirigibles or airships, whatever, had actually passed into our space before, and we didn't know until they were there. And so it's a little bit of, you're not quite sure what it is here. Did we know? We could see it from the ground? So surely we could have been on top of this, but NORAD commanders say no. There are potentially some gaps here. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the story here is not so much about the balloon per se, but the fact that the Chinese spy on us, and they have far, and Melanie could speak in more detail about this than I can, but they have far more sophisticated capabilities up in space, and they have seriously expanded their space surveillance capabilities over the last number of years with satellites. I mean, they are a major player up in space. So I don't know what value added they would have got with a spy balloon to consciously send it over U.S. territory, and the risk seems so much higher. The downside seems so much greater than the upside in terms of what they could have gathered and what could have been gained from this, versus now you have another point of tension in the China-U.S. relationship.
Do you want to add to that, Melanie? What are your thoughts on that? Did China need to do this if they were spying?
Well, so, Vincent is absolutely right. They have very sophisticated satellite surveillance capabilities. There's no question about that. Depending on who you ask, there are some advantages to these lower atmospheric vessels that can get different fidelity on the photograph and the sensing that they can do from that distance, as opposed to further up in space. Whether those advantages are large or small, I think the primary item here is what Vincent referenced earlier, which is that this, to me, and I should say that I am speaking only from information on the outside like everybody else, this very much seems like an embarrassing accident for China. This does not seem to me to be part of a very concerted, multifaceted, super sophisticated balloon spy ring, that's going on over North America. I think part of the progression of the story has been from the idea that it was intentionally sent towards the continent. And since those initial reports, what we've learned is that these kinds of balloons are used regularly by China in the Western Pacific around Guam and other islands there, and that the intelligence community knew about this particular balloon as well and followed its transit over to the continental United States, which is why I'm in part so interested in what in hindsight now seems like a very clumsy and uncoordinated US response to it. So if the intelligence agencies knew about it, there shouldn't have been this gap between, what was known in the Western Pacific, but by the time NORAD appreciated it here on the continent and so on down the line. I also would point out that, the reason there's somewhat of a surveillance gap is that NORAD does its job and does its job well, which is to look for fast objects moving quickly through high levels of the atmosphere towards the continent. A balloon does not meet those characteristics. Now they can clearly find it if, as they've done since, they adjust the radars, the filters, they've called them on the radars, to sort of be able to recognize other items at lower levels of the atmosphere and different characteristics. I don't take this as a criticism of NORAD, which is to say, when they know what they ought to be looking for, they are. It's more to say that if there was to be a concern that NORAD should know about, why did the U.S. intelligence community not convey that information sooner? Or if they did, why was there this strange sequencing of the U.S. response to it? The other item that I would just highlight quickly is that I was giving testimony to Congress, to the House Armed Services Committee here in the United States last week, in the midst of the spy balloon incident. And the nature of political discourse around U.S. China relations right now is so heated that almost every single representative that asked a question about the spy balloon started from the assumption that it was an intentional action on the part of the PRC, and that they were highly critical of what they called the nerve that the PRC would engage in this kind of activity on the eve of the Secretary of State Blinken's planned visit. And there was no sense of openness to the idea that this was unintentional. It was very much interpreted not just as on purpose, but pointedly on purpose on the eve again of this high-level visit that had been planned.
I want to probe that for a minute. I should first say, on your earlier point, that NORAD is kind of trained and ready to react to a much different kind of threat, not a balloon. And it was shown again this week. Russian bombers, which are constantly testing out NORAD's capabilities and response time, did it again this week. They came in over the Arctic to test NORAD capabilities, and NORAD responded in kind, as they do quite frequently, and sent up NORAD jets, and that was the end of the story. And the Russians never crossed into Canadian or American space. But on this point that you witnessed last week, let's assume for a minute that it was deliberate. Why would they deliberately send a balloon over American space? Like, what could be the argument for them doing that?
Well, what I heard as the argument is that it was to be provocative and to be a display of confidence. And it was intended to potentially backfoot Secretary Blinken when he was going to arrive, sort of a limits pushing kind of action. Those are the things that I heard. I won't tell you that I found that to be compelling. I actually think that the PRC had far more to lose than to gain by being provocative or aggressive or assertive or whatever characterization we want to apply to it. But that's what I heard.
Yeah, the other thing I've heard, Peter, is you've seen in the press is this notion of probing North American defenses. So you talked about NORAD and their capabilities, and Melanie's quite right in terms of recalibrating the radars and so on. But send this balloon over North American airspace. Let's see how they react. Let's see what their intergovernmental decision-making process is. Let's see if they do deploy F-22s or F-16s or CF-18s, whatever the case may be. I find that a stretch, personally. I don't think I'd do it with a balloon. Quite frankly, there's lots of other ways you could do this. So that's out there as a theory. But again, this comes back to it just doesn't really hold water. And I'm more in the world of this just sort of happened by accident. And some sources that I have, open sources that I put a great deal of credibility in, sources that are quite connected to governments around the world. I'm hearing that President Xi didn't have a clue that this was happening, and this caught him totally by surprise. And so if this was a big strategic move, to probe the defenses or to undermine the Blinken visit or something like that. If Xi didn't know, it's highly unlikely, I would say. So I'm more and more, I look into this and I wait to be convinced otherwise. I think it was a bad accident that then kind of spiraled out of control.
You know, the Chinese have, you know, they were fairly quick for the Chinese in admitting that it was their balloon, and certainly indicated that the thing went off course, implying that they, you know, there'd been a problem. They'd botched the mission. Have the Americans and the Canadians through NORAD, have they, I know we've got 3 other examples to get to here, and they seem quite different than the balloon, but have the Americans and the Canadians through NORAD, have they botched this in the way they've handled it? Vincent first.
It's a great question, and you've seen this term bandied about in the press: trigger happy, overreacting, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess there are 2 ways to look at this. It comes back to the surveillance gap. So as Melanie was saying, they've got their radars calibrated a certain way, and so stuff is slipping through that it's coming in at a slower speed, lower altitude. It's not an ICBM. It's not a Russian fighter jet, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a gap, and there's an intelligence piece there that maybe they need to get a handle on. In terms of actually responding to shooting down the objects, and for NORAD, it was specifically the object over the Yukon and the object over Lake Huron. The other 2, I think, were done under the authority of Northern Command, which is a strictly U.S. command. But it worked the way it's supposed to work. And it was quite interesting in the press and the Canadian reaction. Why is an American F-22 shooting down an object over Canadian airspace? Well, that's what NORAD's about. It's a binational command that reports up to the Prime Minister and the President, and it did its job, and it operated quite efficiently and effectively. We can have a sidebar debate about the fact it took 2 missiles to shoot the object down over Lake Huron, but they did what they were supposed to do, and it looks like the governance worked well. When the Prime Minister said, "I authorized this being shot down," the Americans immediately came out and said, "You know, we concur with this." The chains briefed up properly. So operationally, I think it worked the way it's supposed to work. But going back to those gaps, those are questions I think that have to be probed a little bit.
Melanie, did it work the way it should have worked, or was there a degree of this whole situation being botched by the American and Canadian side, the NORAD side?
So I don't think it's been botched in that latter sense that you describe. I think tactically and operationally, everything worked, as Vincent aptly said, as it was meant to. And I believe that the U.S. jets were involved in the Canadian incident in particular because they happened to be closest. They were the ones that could get there the most quickly and efficiently. And so I think all of that worked well. I do think from a U.S. perspective that this was botched strategically. I think that, and where I mean that most seriously is in the diplomatic element of it. I think that what it's revealed to me is that the Biden administration either isn't looking for opportunities to keep the U.S. China relationship as stable as possible, much less to make it more productive over time. So either it isn't interested in doing that or it doesn't recognize opportunities to do that. This struck me very much as an opportunity at that strategic level to make some positive movement in the overall relationship. And we didn't do that. But again, at the tactical and operational level, I don't have any qualms about what I saw. And I don't have any qualms about the timing of the shoot down of the big spy balloon. Again, in the policy debates here in Washington, a lot of much was made over whether or not the Biden team should have destroyed the balloon earlier in its transit across the continent. And I don't think those arguments have any purchase. I think that the administration and the military handled it completely properly in terms of shutting down communications of sensitive sites in the United States, trying to gather as much intelligence as we could from the spy balloon itself, and then destroying it safely away from U.S. citizens and residents, and in a place and a time where we could make some recovery effort.
Peter, can I jump in just on one point? I agree with Melanie completely. At the strategic level, I think a lot of questions have to be asked. And as you said, Melanie, China's become such a political football in the US. And I think that the president probably felt like he had to act resolutely, very assertively, and very expeditiously. And so that escalated a little bit. And so in situations like this, it's always a test in terms of escalation. One of my greatest fears about the China-US, China-Western relationship is escalation, whether it's over Taiwan, South China Sea, or something like this. And so this is going to be really interesting that yes, maybe the US escalated it by calling out the Chinese right away. But what I found really interesting is that they did reach out to the Chinese, and Secretary of Defense Austin did reach out to his counterpart to say, okay, we really should chat about this. It was a little bit like the red phone from the Cold War days where, Kennedy gets on the line to Khrushchev and says, okay, let's try and talk our way through this. The Chinese didn't pick up the phone. And I thought it was really interesting because what they said was the atmosphere wasn't good enough right now. Interesting choice of words. But I would suggest in a situation like that, that's the right atmosphere where you need to talk. And otherwise it becomes action reaction. And so then it's escalated since. And so you've got the American reactions, then the Chinese pointing their fingers and saying, well, we've got records of 10 balloons flying over Chinese airspace, and you do this and you do that. And it's become a bit of a tit for tat. So they should look very closely after this. There's going to be a lessons learned both sides. Those protocols, those red phone type protocols that really should have kicked in, but they didn't.
So if I could just add a quick point on some of what I think Vincent really usefully raised here. So the first is when we go back to the Chinese reaction, I think it's really significant. The Chinese are very careful about how they communicate, what words they use. And they used, in this case, after acknowledging that the balloon was theirs, even though they called it, a climate research or atmospheric research balloon, not a spy balloon, but they expressed regret. And that actually word choice is a non-trivial thing. I know it sounds very small potatoes, but it isn't in terms of the kind of discourse that the PRC uses externally. It harkens back to the Hainan Island incident where the EP-3, a US EP-3 and a Chinese fighter jet had contact. They both crashed. The Chinese pilot died, and the EP-3 was grounded, and there was a negotiation over the course of 11 days to get the US crew back. And the United States expressed its regret about the EP-3's flight path and the fact of the incident. And so for the PRC to use the word regret here, I think has that historical antecedent that adds some connotation to it that we might not have treated as seriously as we could have. In terms of the phone call, frankly, at that point, my view of it is that the PRC didn't really have a lot of incentive to answer the phone. There was nothing urgent or emergent happening. There was not a heightened moment of crisis that might involve the loss of life, for example. And we were the ones who'd canceled everything. And so it's not clear from that perspective why they should be welcoming of our phone call, because it sort of works better for us. That in part is why Blinken's visit could have been so important, because Vincent's absolutely right. We need to have mechanisms in place for crisis management. And so you can send the Secretary of State over in this moment where the CCP doesn't have plausible deniability that this has happened. So we have a little bit of leverage in the conversation, and we can talk about things like, this is a crisis. It's a very moderate crisis insofar as it's only a bag full of helium and some technology strapped to it. There's no people involved. We got to figure out how we're going to do this better. And also, by the way, let's talk about things like violations of international law and your other bad behaviors in other places around the world. And we just didn't take advantage of this opportunity.
Gosh, I thought you were going to say that they didn't answer the phone because they don't use landlines anymore. Sorry, just a little bad Mansbridge humor there. Let me dial the timetable back a couple of days, because it was only last week that you literally had, and I think this was addressing some of the fear that was awash in the land. You had, from the podium of the White House, one of the president's spokespeople saying, these aren't aliens. This is not from another planet, which really did sound bizarre that we were hearing this. not in a movie, but in real life. However, it did address this issue of that fear in the land. And I think that's what raises the term that Vincent does about whether or not the American Canadian side became trigger happy with that fear out there. Because since the balloon, there were these three objects that were shot down. We all know where they were shot down. But it's increasingly becoming apparent these were not, they weren't balloons, they weren't spy technology. They were, what's the term? They were benign and probably private. Could be a university research project, could be any number of things. But during that period, in a period of about 48 hours, when they shot down whatever they saw, did they become trigger happy? Vincent?
It's a great question. I think when all is said and done, we'll be able to look back in hindsight and I think provide a definitive judgment. And it's always easier with hindsight and saying, oh, come on, clearly they overreacted here. It's pretty clear. It was a university science project. It was a high school project. I think, again, you have to put it in context, though, that you've got this Chinese spy balloon. It looks pretty evident that's what it is. And then you recalibrate your radar and you start seeing potentially more of these things. And so you're kind of scratching your head and going, that's weird. As Melanie was saying, and as I responded as well, you've got a heightened political atmosphere in the US where you've got to do something and you've got to take action. And so you can use that as a supporting argument or an argument they overreacted because they overreacted to political pressure on the US side in particular, at least. And so they went in guns blazing. You know, we'll shoot first and we'll ask questions later. And then there's also the argument that, well, whether they were Chinese, Russian, North Korean, or spycraft with ray guns, really they were flying at a level where they were a threat to civilian aircraft. And that to me at first made a lot of sense. But then I've since been thinking about it that what they're now saying is that there's a ton of this junk up in the atmosphere, all kinds of this stuff. So why these three particular objects as opposed to all kinds of other junk that's floating around? And I mean, it's interesting that I read this morning that they think that the object that was shot down in northern Alaska, just on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, there's some kind of a hobbyist group in northern Illinois saying that one of their balloons is missing. You know, it's funny, but it's not funny. And the thing had been up there for like 120 days or something like that. I'm thinking, dear Lord, if it's been up there that long, all these other things that are floating about, and so where do you stop? So I think it's too early to say whether they overreacted or not, but I do think President Biden's comment yesterday, first, you've got to track this stuff a little bit better. It's like tracking space debris probably, and about as challenging. And again, Melanie will know more than I do, but what's up there and what do we have to look out for? And then some kind of a protocol so that you're not shooting down something every time it looks somewhat suspicious, because that seems to be kind of what they did this week. If in doubt, just shoot it down. I love that term they were using over and over again, an abundance of caution. Okay, I do get that in the circumstances, but you can't be doing that every 20 minutes. Otherwise, you know, you're going to have Sidewinder missiles flying all over the sky in Canada and the US. So that I'm kind of avoiding your question, Peter, a little bit, but that's where I'd come down right now.
Well, it does make you wonder what is up there, you know, that we didn't know about. What do we know now that we didn't know 10 days ago on that question? And let's make sure we're framing the up there properly. We're not talking about space. We're talking about the atmosphere, right? And we're talking about, I mean, last night I flew from Calgary to Toronto, and as I was flying at whatever it was, you know, 36,000 feet, I was thinking, well, what else is up here? Like what else could be coming along here at any moment that nobody knows about? I mean, Melanie, what is your sense? What do you know, given the studies that you're involved in, about just how much more stuff is sort of up there that we never knew about?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there is stuff up there. We as a general public don't generally know about it or think about it. If you talk to pilots, whether those be fighter jets or helicopters or anything in between, they will tell you they see stuff all the time. It's not news to them, so to speak, that there would be this sort of, I don't know if debris is too minimal a word to apply to it, but there are things out there, and we know that there's some of this stuff for scientific experiments, for climate sensing and meteorological data gathering, and all of these sorts of things. And we've all managed just fine for a very long time. And so I don't think we need to have any heightened, a real sense of insecurity about the fact that we now are able to see some of these things because we have chosen to look at our surrounding atmosphere a little bit differently for the time being. So I don't want people to be running around feeling like it's unsafe to fly, for example, or that things are falling out of the sky or any of those sorts of things. But surely there are things up there. And Vincent mentioned there's an enormous amount of debris and space junk in orbit as well, and we all seem generally to manage all right with the majority of the tasks that we need to undertake today. So I don't want anybody to be worried about it. I will just say, I think Vincent was admirably moderate in his response about whether or not this was an overreaction. I sit in a very, frothy place here in Washington, D.C. And so it is difficult for me to separate out the rapidity with which the Biden administration was willing to shoot down these three additional items after having been criticized rather vigorously for not having shot down the spy balloon faster. Now, I'm unwilling to say that there's causation at play. I will just say that there is a decided atmosphere of, shoot first, think later at the moment. One does also have to wonder if we operate under the presumption that we are now looking for and indeed finding more things. Why have we seen 3 days consecutively of shoot downs and then nothing since? So there are elements of this that one could at least build into a narrative that says this was politically motivated. And now maybe things are calming down and we're going to revert back to some sort of mean form of behavior. So as I say, I'm unwilling to say that the political element is causal. I will just say that as an individual living in the United States, my perception is that they are not unrelated.
All right. If I can jump in, we're very focused on the U.S. political dynamics, but the Canadian political dynamics are very interesting as well. Maybe you're heading that way with the next question. But I found it interesting that there was this clamoring for more information, and there was the spy balloon, but then as these 3 shoot downs happened in rapid succession, tell us more, tell us more, tell us more. And having been in the bureaucracy for 30 years, I know what it's like on that side. Okay, yes, we need to go public, but we have to be 100% clear on what we're going to be telling the public. We don't want to generate hysteria. And so I understood why it was taking a little while before a little bit more information came out. And even now, what we don't have the debris, so we can't definitively say what these objects were. But I noted at one point, the Prime Minister said earlier in the week that I think there's a pattern here between the first balloon and the next 3. And I found that very interesting when it came out. I forget what day it was. I think it was maybe Tuesday or Wednesday. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And of course, the media immediately jumps on top of it. Oh, maybe they are spy balloons. Doesn't look like it was a pattern now. And so I think that goes to the point, be very, very careful what you say publicly about these things until you have the information. So you've got these 2 opposing forces. You got to get out. You got to get out. You got to get ahead of the story. And I'm a big fan of transparency and national security. I've spoken out about it. I think a lot of our intelligence agencies need to be more transparent. But then when you do go out, you better make sure you have it right, and you better not speculate. So just an interesting sidebar.
Okay, let me just mention 2 things. We're kind of at the halfway mark. We invite questions. I know there's a couple hundred people listening and watching this discussion. So if you have a question, just go to the Q&A function and put it down, and we'll certainly try to ask it. The second one, before we broaden the conversation a little bit, is just to you, Vincent, and it's on the angle of the Canadian situation in this. Do you, I mean, I understand power structures. I understand how NORAD works. And at the moment, there's an American general who's at the top of the NORAD structure, and obviously has a say in certain things that happen all along with the president and the prime minister. But do you find it in any way odd that when missiles were fired in situations that involved both Canadian and American jets, that it was the Americans who fired them and not the Canadians? Does that strike you in any way as odd? This is including over Canadian space.
No, I honestly don't. That's the way it was meant to work. And the chief of the defense staff sent out a tweet, I think it was yesterday or the day before, saying it worked the way it was drawn up on the blackboard. It's a binational command. And so I know a lot of people get very nervous on the Canadian side, because whenever we talk about Canada-US relations, sovereignty, and there's sensitivities over that, but that's the way it's supposed to work. It was a joint decision by the US and Canadian governments at the highest levels, the prime minister and the president. But then operationally, you use the combined forces. And so as Melanie said, it was an F-22 that happened to be there first. And so that's what did the shoot down. If it had been an F-18, CF-18, they would have done it. So in my view, operationally, it worked the way it was supposed to work.
Okay.
I know it's odd for Canadians.
Yes.
I know it's odd for Canadians. Why is an American jet shooting down something over Canadian territory? I think it's because it's the first time it ever happened. And so people are trying to get their minds wrapped around. It's like, holy crap, is that what actually happens? Yeah.
What about when the American jet misses on the first take? Why didn't the Canadians shoot the second one? Anyway,
I said that before. That's a whole other discussion. Those things cost $450,000 each. So it was $1 million for a couple of shots almost. So
yeah, well, they got a Indiana research balloon or whatever it was. Moving on. Let's broaden the discussion. And Melanie, let me go to one of your clear strengths and concerns and passions, and that is the relationship that exists between the United States and its allies and China. What do you think this has done to that relationship, or what do you think this has exposed about that relationship?
Yeah, thanks. I have to say, Peter, this is an area that I'm profoundly interested in, because I really worry very much about the direction of travel of the U.S. relationship with China and, by association, partners and allies, and the extent to which it's becoming more globally antagonistic. And I think it is really worrisome. And so, I think this incident, unfortunately, doesn't reveal anything particularly that we didn't already know about how fragile and unsteady this relationship already is. I think it is a reminder of how dangerous it could become very quickly and inadvertently. I think it reveals, at least in the United States and certainly in the policy community here in Washington, D.C., that the reflex is to attribute ill intent to pretty much everything that the PRC does. I think Vincent did a nice job outlining earlier some of the theories about how and why this might have been a deliberate incursion on the part of the PRC. The spy balloon might have been intentionally sent, and why. And I have to say, all of those theories and others that I've heard strike me as being way too clever by half. That it attributes an enormous amount of calculation and coordination and malign intent to the PRC over something that is a balloon that is visible to the human eye of people standing on the ground. And I just think that reflex coming out in an incident like this, which if you step back a little bit, it is really silly how often we've had to say the word balloon, in a nefarious sort of way over the last couple of weeks. I think it also reveals that we tend to forget just how present the West is in China's region of the world. That the United States, we don't send balloons over China because, in part, we don't have to, whether for probing purposes or general sensing purposes. We fly our airplanes, very close to the Chinese mainland in legal airspace over legal international waters. We do it all very legally, and it's right there. China doesn't do that to the United States or to Canada, in the same way, in part because they can't. And we don't have that sense of imaginative empathy about what that imbalance might mean for the Chinese. And so it's this strange, very volatile moment where we come from a position of an enormous amount of advantage still in the relationship, the United States allies and partners do. And yet this extreme sense of insecurity and a willingness to attribute always the worst to the PRC, even as Vincent pointed out, there are indications that she and others in the apparatus had no idea that this was happening, sort of the opposite of malign intent. It's, again, to my mind, initially when it came out, it was an embarrassing accident. It demonstrates that he doesn't have the kind of control organizationally that he would like to convey that he does.
Let me just follow that up by asking you this question that Neville Austin just sent in. He says, China asserted that it would reserve the right to react to the shooting down of the balloon, the spy balloon, the first one. What do you think China will do now, if anything, as a reaction? Melanie?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. I think it's pretty standard for the PRC to respond to say, hey, we reserve the right. I think in similar circumstances, the United States, at least I won't speak for Canada, would do the same. I think if we were to fly a balloon over China, they would shoot it down, is one form in which they might react. I don't anticipate right now them moving into any physical domains. I think we're going to continue to have an exchange of barbs and a war of words, so to speak. And yet, if it were to come back around in the future as something that seemed like an opportunistic moment, that the PRC would take it. I just don't think anything like that is particularly likely at the moment.
Here's a question for you, Vincent, and it's from our old friend Mel Cap. Can you tell us about the communications between Washington, Ottawa, and Colorado Springs? And Colorado Springs is where NORAD headquarters are based. What do you think those communications were likely to be over these last 2 weeks? How would that have worked?
Sure, I'd love to answer that question. Can I just respond, though, to something that Melanie said about China and offer a Canadian perspective very, very quickly?
Sure.
I agree with everything that Melanie said, and U.S. may have overplayed his hand a little bit here, up the rhetoric. And I agree. We're in their backyard all the time. And so they got into our backyard accidentally, and there's a little bit of hysteria. But in the Canadian debate, I've been stating publicly, and I know the government's been slowly coming around to the fact that this is still a hostile state, and they conduct hostile state activities. Front page of the Globe and Mail today, Fife and Chase, big story about foreign interference, cyber, espionage, theft of intellectual property, disinformation, misinformation. The list goes on and on and on. And we, of course, got the two Michaels experience as well. So it's kind of ironic that on the one hand, this was a misstep on the Chinese part. But on the other hand, I think it does highlight once again that this is a state that does spy on us. And yes, everybody spies. We all know that. This is just a measure of any nation statecraft. But I think it does once again highlight the fact that China is a hostile state actor, and they are aggressive more on the international stage, and they are doing stuff in our respective countries, the U.S. and Canada. All the things that I mentioned for Canada is obviously the same, exponentially more so in the United States. So it's I find it kind of a paradox that it seems like it may have just been an accidental misstep, but on the other hand, it once again shows that China is a concern. In response to Mel's question, there would have been very, very, very close discussions between Ottawa and Washington throughout. I suspect the last couple of weekends, Global Affairs Canada would have been in touch with the State Department. Obviously, the Canadian Armed Forces in touch with the U.S. Armed Forces, Department of National Defense, deputy ministers to undersecretaries, et cetera. At the center, the Privy Council office, the National Security Intelligence Advisor, my successor would have been in touch probably with Jake Sullivan or somebody in the National Security Council. So there would have been lots and lots and lots of conversations. And at the operational level, absolutely, the CAF, being a member, being a part of NORAD, there would have been lots of operational discussions in Colorado Springs as to what to do in terms of gathering the data and then how to respond in terms of deploying aircraft, et cetera. So I've been at the coalface on these kinds of, not with respect to balloons, but in moments of crisis, and we're joined up. We're really joined up. So I have no doubt that there was lots and lots of discussion.
All right, Melanie, this one's for you from Michael Farah. I've heard that the reason why China would use a balloon to spy, despite their strong satellite capabilities, is because they're specialized in communication spying and interception. What are your thoughts?
Well, so I don't have any specific knowledge about what was attached to this particular spy balloon. What I will say is that we've heard repeatedly, openly and privately from U.S. government officials that the Department of Defense knows how to protect and defend its signals from unintentional capture by others' technologies. So the knowledge that the balloon was in U.S. airspace triggered immediately a chain of reactions by the Department of Defense to secure those lines of communications and essentially lock them down. We heard this as recently as I think it was Wednesday. We had an Undersecretary of State, Wendy Sherman, come and convey this very clearly, that all of those communications elements were well protected. So if that was the intent of the technology on this particular balloon, it seems very unlikely that it achieved its mission objectives.
Good question here from Mary Bartlett, who kind of sums up what we've been through these last couple of weeks. And what she asks, and Vincent, why don't you handle this? How should NORAD respond to future objects, I guess, that they can't determine what they are, being found in North American airspace?
Well, I hit upon this a little bit earlier, and I think that, as President Biden said yesterday, we've got to have some protocols developed in terms of shoot down, because as Melanie said, you fire at these three objects when there are all these other objects out there. We can't get into a pattern of shooting and asking questions later. So I think that we need to have, and I'm sure this is happening right now inside the United States, but then jointly with Canada, new protocols, new procedures on how this is going to happen. I think, as President Biden said, these will be classified. They're not going to be made public because, of course, you don't want to give your adversaries potential information on how they may want to probe in the future. So I think that is certainly something that needs to happen. But
give us a sense, like, what possible protocol could you have for something that you do not know what it is, and it's in your airspace, and it's at an altitude that could be a potential problem?
So I've been to NORAD headquarters in Cheyenne Mountain, but I've never actually sat behind one of those radar screens before. So I don't know what those radar technicians are saying when they look at that screen and they see a blip this big and then a blip this big. So I don't know how that works. And as for the F-22 pilot or the CF-18 or the F-16 pilot, same sort of thing. They see something out there, and how big is it? I don't know how those protocols would work. That gets done at sort of tactical, operational level. I'm sure there'll be somewhere in those protocols, it'll be case by case, but it might be the size, it might be the amount of intelligence you have, it might be where in the country you're looking at it, all kinds of different things. So that's probably would play into it. But what's also interesting is that we're all focused right now on these balloons and shoot down protocol, et cetera. But the bigger picture, the bigger question for NORAD is upgrading their radars writ large. And the technology right now from the North Warning Line is 1970s, 1980s technology. And so Canada and the United States is working right now on upgrading that technology to respond to what are the real threats out there. Because I'm sorry, but the balloons or atmospheric junk, they're not the threat. The threat is still going to be intercontinental ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, things like that. So NORAD needs to upgrade its technology, over the horizon radar, things like that. And we're slowly getting moving. The Canadian government announced, I think, $5 billion in funding towards this last year. We've got to get moving on that. That's really the priority.
Melanie, should we be calling this, B. Chow writes this question, should we still be calling this Chinese spy balloon or just a Chinese balloon?
Well, first, let me I am going to foot stomp what Vincent just said. I think, technological upgrades should be an enormous priority, sort of broadly speaking, for Western defense apparatus, especially including command and control kinds of systems. But should we be calling it the spy balloon or just the balloon? I think based on the information that I've seen, it is still fair to call it a spy balloon. And I'm a believer in calling things what they are. This was not a climate flotation device or anything else. It may not have been intended to spy on the continental United States or Canada on its path, but it was intended to spy on US assets. They just happened to be in the Western Pacific. It just happened to run in an Arctic, blast of air that both shoved it in a direction that it didn't want to go, and probably removed a lot of the atmospheric cloud cover that made it much more visible. Nonetheless, it was designed to spy.
Got about 5 minutes left for questions. Will Fripp writes, what is this incident, and this will be for you again, Melanie, what does this incident say about communications within the American intelligence community that the balloon may have been tracked since launch, but NORAD admitted there was a gap?
Yeah, that's an area where, again, I remain really, really interested to see what the actual process was. My suspicion is that the intelligence community knew everything it needed and wanted to know for a very long time. The question isn't what happened internal to the intelligence community. The question is what happened when it needed to go outside of the intelligence community, and how the necessary information was identified, how it was conveyed, to whom it was conveyed, and when. So I think it's really much more an interagency and coordination concern that I have than it is internal to the intelligence services themselves.
And Vincent, that may have been what Mel was getting at, asking that question of the communications between Colorado Springs and Washington and or Ottawa.
I was just going to say, Peter, we certainly have those coordination issues inside the Canadian government as well. I mean, it's one of the great challenges, and so much information being out there from so many different sources, open sources, signals intelligence, human intelligence, pulling it all together and then getting it up to the decision makers in a timely fashion. Canada's got problems like that as well, and are trying to address them. So, but it's exponentially more difficult in the US because they have so many more people looking at these issues, and it's such a bigger organization.
Yeah, and if I could add just one last point about this, the intelligence community is going to be disinclined to destroy these sorts of things. It's much more useful from an intelligence perspective to not shoot things down and instead to learn as much from them as we can, and not play the hand that to the other side that we know more than we want them to think that we know. And so I just want to highlight that as well, that there is an institutional reticence potentially to putting those kinds of assets in a situation where you might lose any intelligence you could gain from them.
And good luck trying to find that stuff in Yukon. I mean, not only is it in the middle of nowhere where that was shot down, it's -50 and it snows. That stuff could be gone for decades if it's ever found. But Melanie, just show you how closely some people listen to every word that they hear from the two of you. Dennis Waddington writes, to Melanie's comment that pilots in civil airspace do see lots of strange objects, do they come in clusters or waves? Does NORAD or anyone compile and analyze such insights?
I wish that it were so systematic as that. I just hear reports spottily from people doing their day jobs. That's their job to be up there and flying around. And so it's not a coordinated data gathering exercise, as far as I'm aware. It's much more, pilots swapping stories and sharing their experiences of what's happened. So I'm not in a position to know if there's waves or patterns or any of those sorts of things. I just occasionally know I get to hear stories about things people saw when they were flying around.
Let me bring this to some form of conclusion by asking that classic question. Governments, wherever they are, their main role is to keep their people safe, right? It's to protect their people. So whether you're the government of China or the government of the United States or the government of Canada, are we safer today than we were 10 days ago? Vincent, you start.
I think it's about the same as it was. I don't think we're less safe or more safe, quite frankly. I think, again, this was a spy balloon, and then 3 objects that looked like they were just debris. The spy balloon, we don't like having devices over our territory conducting espionage, but they were not shooting at people or dropping bombs or anything like that. I know there's been calls to elevate the threat level in Canada and the United States, and we've got to be more vigilant. Sure, we can always be more vigilant. And I think that just speaking about the first balloon now, if this raises the national security consciousness in Canada, I think that's a good thing. And again, to Melanie saying that U.S. maybe overplayed his hand with China, I think it's good for Canada to understand that there are threats out there, and China remains a hostile actor. Again, given this broader context of all the other things they do. But I'm not going to go to bed tonight going, holy cow, thank God that passed by, because it was so dangerous and I feel under threat or anything like that. No, not at all. But at the same time, if Canadians can just take their national security a little bit more seriously, let's take a good crisis. What's the old saying? Don't let a good crisis go to waste. We can raise the consciousness of Canadians and have a public debate about all this. And again, not overreacting, not hyperventilating, not being hyperactive about this, but have a reasoned debate about threats that are out there. But in terms of actual physical security today, I don't feel any more threatened or less threatened.
Melanie, same question to you.
Well, I agree with Vincent on pretty much everything that he said, and I'll add only a couple of items to it. So in the first instance, he's exactly right. China has amassed a very long record of very bad behavior. They have acted with hostile intent and against in ways that run counter to international laws and norms. And it is right and proper that the United States, allies and partners push back on the ways and places and times that the PRC behaves that way. I think that we are in the near term, in the immediacy, no less safe today than we were 3 weeks ago. Nobody should be running around concerned that physical harm is about to befall them, and that this is some indication that we are constantly under the sword of Damocles, and at any moment some other atmospheric entity is going to do something that harms us or our way of life. I do think, unfortunately, that this incident highlights that it's increased our longer term risk and made the situation more dangerous, in part because it was another, pull on that already thin thread of U.S. China relations and moved it really in an unproductive direction. Again, Vincent and I have both said this was a crisis that was let go to waste, and in fact made even worse potentially by some mishandling, I think, diplomatically and otherwise. And so that fact alone continues to worry me and concern me for the long-term direction of the relationship, where I'd love to see much more stability, much lower temperatures, and to be able to walk us all back from some ledges that I think we're creeping up upon.
Fabulous conversation. Thank you both for all the insight you've given us and all the things you've provided for us to consider over the next little while we think about this story. So Melanie in Washington and Vincent in Ottawa, thank you much, and thanks to the Munk School for providing this opportunity for all of those of you who've tuned in to listen to. Thanks very much. Bye for now.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate it. And great questions from the audience.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yep.